My neighbor, Veronica Sterling, looked me straight in the eye and said, "Nobody loves you, Elena. You're just a pathetic old woman living alone. Why don't you just die already?" She said this standing in my own driveway in front of the house I'd called home for 42 years in Meadowbrook Estates. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I simply smiled and said, "You know what, Veronica? You're absolutely right about one thing. Nobody around here knows the real me." 3 weeks later, when my secret family arrived for Thanksgiving, Veronica's jaw dropped so hard I thought she might need medical attention. Before we dive into this story, I'm curious. Have you ever had someone completely underestimate who you really are? Drop your most surprising plot twist moment in the comments below. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button if you enjoy stories about people getting exactly what they deserve. Your support truly means the world to me. The crisp November morning started like any other in Meadowbrook Estates, an exclusive gated community nestled in the rolling hills of Westfield County. At 74, I'd settled into the comfortable rhythms of retirement that had defined my days for the past 9 years. My name is Elena Rodriguez-Martinez, and to most of my neighbors, I was exactly what I appeared to be, a soft-spoken widow who kept to herself, maintained an immaculate garden, and never caused any trouble for anyone. My daily routine was as predictable as clockwork. I woke each morning at 5:30 a.m., made my coffee in the same ceramic mug I'd used for 20 years, and settled onto my front porch to watch the sunrise paint the mountains in shades of gold and amber. The house itself was a modest 2-story colonial in cream-colored brick with forest green shutters and a wraparound porch that had sold me on the property 4 decades ago when my late husband Miguel and I first moved to Meadowbrook Estates. Back then, the neighborhood had been different. Families with young children, backyard barbecues that lasted until midnight, impromptu block parties where everyone contributed something homemade. Miguel and I had fit right in. Him with his infectious laugh and gift for fixing anything with an engine, me with my legendary tres leches cake that neighbors still asked about years after I'd stopped making it regularly. Those were the golden years of Meadowbrook Estates, when the Homeowners Association meetings were about organizing Easter egg hunts and coordinating snow removal, not about property values and architectural compliance. When neighbors borrowed cups of sugar and actually returned the measuring cups, when children rode bicycles in the streets until the streetlights came on and their parents sat on front porches sharing stories and cold drinks. But neighborhoods, like people, change over time. The original families had grown up and moved away, selling their homes to younger couples with different priorities and perspectives. The community spirit that had once defined Meadowbrook Estates had gradually given way to a more formal, distant atmosphere, where people knew their neighbors' lawn maintenance schedules better than their first names. I'd adapted to these changes with the same grace I'd brought to every major transition in my life. When Miguel died of a sudden heart attack 6 years ago, I could have sold the house and moved somewhere smaller, somewhere that didn't echo with 40 years of shared memories. Instead, I'd chosen to stay, to maintain the gardens Miguel had lovingly designed, to preserve the home where we'd been genuinely happy. The house wasn't large by Meadowbrook Estate standards, just 3 bedrooms, 2.5 baths, and a combined living and dining area that overlooked the backyard. But it was perfectly suited to my needs, and I'd maintained it with the kind of meticulous care that comes from having both the time and the deep personal investment that turns a house into a home. Every morning, after my coffee and sunrise ritual, I would walk through my gardens, checking on the roses Miguel had planted for our 25th anniversary, deadheading the perennials, adjusting the irrigation system he'd installed himself. The backyard was my particular pride, a carefully orchestrated symphony of color that bloomed from early spring through late fall, with something flowering in every season. Miguel had been the technical genius behind our landscaping, understanding soil pH and drainage and which plants would thrive in which microclimates around our property. But I'd been the artistic vision, choosing color combinations and planning sightlines and creating the kind of outdoor spaces that made people slow their evening walks just to admire the view from the sidewalk. After my garden rounds, I would typically spend an hour or 2 on household maintenance, laundry, light cleaning, organizing the craft room where I pursued my various hobbies. I'd taken up quilting seriously after Miguel's death, finding comfort in the precise, methodical work of creating something beautiful from small, seemingly insignificant pieces. The spare bedroom had been converted into my quilting studio with a large cutting table, industrial sewing machine, and carefully organized storage for my growing collection of fabrics. 3 afternoons a week, I volunteered at the Westfield County Public Library, helping elderly patrons navigate the computer systems and assisting with the children's reading program. It was work that brought me genuine satisfaction. There's something deeply rewarding about helping a 70-year-old grandfather send his first email to grandchildren across the country, or watching a shy 6-year-old discover that reading can be an adventure rather than a chore.
The library staff had become something like an extended family to me over the years. Sarah, the head librarian, always saved interesting book recommendations for my Tuesday shifts. Marcus, the teenage volunteer who helped with computer maintenance, had appointed himself my personal tech support guru, patiently explaining smartphone features I'd never known existed. Mrs. Chen, who ran the children's programs, had convinced me to help with story time, discovering that I had an unexpected talent for dramatic readings that kept even the most restless toddlers engaged. Evenings were for simple pleasures, preparing dinner for one with the same care I'd once brought to meals for two, settling into my favorite reading chair with whatever mystery novel had caught my attention, or working on my current quilting project while classical music played softly from the radio Miguel had insisted on installing in every room of the house. It was a quiet life, perhaps, but it was a contented one. I had my routines, my small circle of library friends, my gardens, and my crafts. I had enough money to live comfortably, thanks to Miguel's careful financial planning, and my own modest teacher's pension from the 35 years I'd spent in Westfield County elementary schools. I had my health, my independence, and the deep satisfaction that comes from a life well-lived and purposefully chosen. What I didn't have, according to most of my neighbors, was anything interesting enough to merit their attention or consideration. This suited me perfectly fine for the first few years after Miguel's death. I was grieving, rediscovering who I was as an individual rather than half of a couple, learning to make decisions without the partner who'd shared every major choice for 43 years of marriage. The neighbors' polite disinterest gave me space to heal and rebuild without unwanted sympathy or intrusive questions about my emotional state. But 2 years ago, everything changed when Veronica Sterling moved into the house directly across the street. Veronica was 45, recently divorced, and determined to establish herself as the undisputed queen of Meadowbrook Estates' social hierarchy. She'd purchased the largest house in our section of the community, a sprawling contemporary monstrosity that had been built 5 years earlier when the original 1970s ranch house was demolished for being architecturally incompatible with the neighborhood's evolving aesthetic standards. The new house was a testament to expensive, bad taste. All sharp angles and floor-to-ceiling windows painted in aggressive shades of gray and white that made it look more like a corporate office building than a family home. Veronica had furnished it with the kind of aggressively modern furniture that appeared in design magazines but seemed deeply uncomfortable for actual human habitation. From the moment the moving trucks pulled away, it became clear that Veronica viewed Meadowbrook Estates as her personal kingdom and herself as its self-appointed sovereign. She drove a pristine white Tesla Model X, always wore designer athletic wear despite never appearing to exercise, and had opinions about everything, especially things that were absolutely none of her business. Veronica's background, as pieced together from various neighborhood conversations, painted a picture of someone accustomed to getting her way through a combination of money, manipulation, and sheer force of personality. She'd been married to a successful plastic surgeon for 15 years before their acrimonious divorce, which had apparently involved accusations of financial impropriety and resulted in a settlement that left her quite wealthy, but also quite bitter about the experience of being publicly humiliated. Her 2 children, Madison 17 and Connor 15, lived with their father most of the time, but spent alternating weekends at Veronica's house where they seemed as uncomfortable as visitors in an expensive hotel. I often saw them sitting on the front steps during their mandated visits, scrolling through their phones with the resigned expression of people serving time rather than enjoying family moments. Within 6 months of moving in, Veronica had inserted herself into every neighborhood conversation, appointed herself head of the Homeowners Association's Community Standards Committee, and begun making suggestions about how various neighbors could improve their properties to better align with her vision of what Meadowbrook Estates should represent. Mrs. Patterson's cottage garden was too informal and needed structural elements. The Johnson family's children's playground equipment was inappropriate for a luxury community. The Chen family's vegetable garden was agricultural looking and should be relocated to the backyard where it wouldn't impact property values. The Morrison family's older model Honda was bringing down the neighborhood's prestige and should be parked in the garage rather than the driveway. But Veronica saved her most pointed criticism for me. It started subtly, as these things often do. Comments delivered with fake concern and wrapped in the language of helpfulness. Observations about how my rose bushes were getting a bit wild and might benefit from professional landscaping services. Suggestions that my house could use updating because the 1980s aesthetic is really showing its age. Recommendations for senior-friendly lawn care services that could take the burden of yard work off your shoulders. I responded to these early comments with the same polite pleasantness I'd cultivated over 70 years of dealing with difficult people. "I'll certainly consider that," became my standard response, delivered with a gentle smile that gave no indication of my actual thoughts about Veronica's unsolicited advice. But Veronica interpreted my politeness as weakness, and weakness in Veronica's world was something to be exploited rather than respected. The comments became more frequent and more pointed. My morning coffee ritual on the front porch was making the neighborhood look like a retirement community and sending the wrong message about property values. My afternoon garden work was obsessive and suggested I needed more social interaction with people my own age. My evening walks around the neighborhood were concerning because elderly people shouldn't be wandering around alone after dark. Each criticism was delivered with the kind of manufactured concern that made it difficult to respond without appearing ungrateful or defensive. Veronica had perfected the art of the backhanded compliment, the helpful suggestion that was actually an insult, the expression of worry that was really an attack on someone's competence or judgment. Still, I maintained my composure and continued my routines. I'd learned long ago that some people mistake kindness for stupidity, and I was genuinely curious to see exactly how far Veronica Sterling would push before she discovered just how wrong she was about quiet, unremarkable Elena Rodriguez-Martinez. The escalation began in earnest this past spring when Veronica decided that my front garden was negatively impacting her property values. She began documenting what she called maintenance issues with digital photographs, submitting formal complaints to the Homeowners Association about inconsistent landscaping standards that were creating an uneven aesthetic throughout the community. The complaints were groundless. My gardens were meticulously maintained and had actually won the neighborhood's Garden of the Month award 3 times in the past 5 years. But Veronica's campaign was persistent and increasingly personal. She began timing her daily activities to coincide with mine, appearing on her front porch whenever I was working in my garden, making loud phone conversations about property value concerns and aging neighbors who can't maintain their homes properly. The summer brought new levels of harassment disguised as neighborly concern. Veronica began calling the city's code enforcement office with anonymous complaints about overgrown vegetation and potential safety hazards.
She started a whisper campaign among newer residents about how certain properties were bringing down the standards that made Meadowbrook Estates a desirable place to live. When these tactics failed to achieve whatever outcome Veronica was hoping for, she escalated to more direct confrontation. She began positioning herself at the end of her driveway during my morning coffee time, making pointed comments about how some people had too much time on their hands and needed to find more productive ways to spend their days. She started timing her own garden work to coincide with mine, hiring a professional landscaping crew to perform elaborate maintenance on her already perfect lawn, while making loud comments about how real homeowners invested in professional property management rather than trying to do everything themselves. The breaking point came last month when Veronica convinced 2 other neighbors to join her in petitioning the Homeowners Association to implement new community standards that would effectively require every property to conform to her aesthetic preferences. The petition included specific language about age-appropriate landscaping and maintenance capabilities that was clearly designed to target my gardening activities. I attended the Homeowners Association meeting where the petition was discussed, sitting quietly in the back row while Veronica presented her case with PowerPoint slides and professional quality photographs. She spoke eloquently about maintaining property values and ensuring community standards and addressing situations where individual homeowners may need additional support to meet neighborhood expectations. When the association president asked if I had any response to the concerns that had been raised, I stood slowly and smiled at the assembled neighbors, many of whom avoided eye contact, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the meeting had taken. "I appreciate Mrs. Sterling's passion for our community," I said quietly. "I think it's wonderful when neighbors care enough to get involved in improving things for everyone." Veronica's expression shifted slightly, as if she hadn't expected such a gracious response to what had clearly been intended as a public humiliation. "I also think," I continued, "that it's important for all of us to remember that communities are strengthened by diversity. Diversity of perspectives, diversity of approaches, and diversity of experiences. Sometimes the most beautiful gardens are the ones that grow a little wild around the edges." The petition was tabled pending further community input, but I could see in Veronica's face that my response had only intensified her determination to find a way to force me into compliance with her vision of what Meadowbrook Estates should be. Which brings us to yesterday morning, when Veronica Sterling finally revealed the true depth of her cruelty and provided me with the perfect opportunity to show her, and everyone else in our little community, exactly who they'd been underestimating for the past 2 years. The November air was crisp with the promise of winter, and I was enjoying my usual morning coffee on the front porch when Veronica emerged from her house wearing her typical uniform of expensive workout clothes and an expression of barely contained irritation. She marched across her perfectly manicured lawn and stopped at the edge of my property, hands planted firmly on her hips in a posture that screamed confrontation. "Elena, we need to talk." I looked up from the mystery novel I'd been reading, setting down my coffee cup with deliberate care. "Good morning, Veronica. Beautiful day, isn't it?" "It's about your situation, and frankly, I'm tired of pretending this isn't a problem for everyone in the neighborhood." I closed my book and gave Veronica my full attention, genuinely curious about what new approach she'd decided to try. "My situation? Look, I've tried to be diplomatic about this, but clearly subtle hints aren't working. You're bringing down the entire community. Your house looks like something from a time capsule. Your garden is a mess of overgrown plants that belong in a botanical preserve, and you spend all day puttering around like some lonely old lady with nothing better to do." I felt something shift inside my chest. Not anger exactly, but a cool recognition that we'd finally reached the moment I'd been anticipating for months. I see. And what would you suggest I do about this situation? Veronica stepped closer, her voice dropping to the tone people use when they think they're being helpful, but are actually being viciously cruel. Elena, honey, I'm going to be completely honest with you because clearly nobody else has the courage to tell you the truth. You're 74 years old, you live alone in a house that's too big for you, and you obviously don't have the energy or resources to maintain it at the level this community expects. What level is that, Veronica? The level that protects all of our property values, the level that maintains the reputation that makes Meadowbrook Estates a desirable place to live, the level that requires homeowners to either invest in proper maintenance or step aside for people who can. She paused, apparently expecting me to respond, but I remained silent, watching her face as she prepared to deliver what she clearly considered the decisive blow. Elena, honey, let's face facts. Nobody really cares about you. I've lived across the street for 2 years, and I've never seen anyone visit you except delivery drivers. You don't have friends over, you don't go anywhere except that little volunteer job at the library. You're just existing. And honestly, it's depressing to watch, and it's affecting everyone else's quality of life. I stood slowly, setting my book aside with the same careful attention I brought to all my movements. I see. And I'm not trying to be cruel, Veronica continued, though every word was calculated for maximum damage. I'm trying to help you understand that maybe it's time to consider alternatives. A nice retirement community where you'd have people your own age to talk to. Somewhere with activities and meal plans and staff who are paid to care about your well-being. She took a step closer, her voice dropping to a whisper that was somehow more menacing than shouting would have been. Elena, honey, nobody loves you. You're just a pathetic old woman living alone in a house that's falling apart around you. Why don't you just die already and let someone who actually matters buy this place and turn it into something worthwhile? The words hung in the November air like poison, and I felt the morning quiet around us deepen, as if the universe itself was holding its breath to witness this moment of calculated cruelty. I looked at Veronica Sterling, 45 years old, perfectly coiffed, radiating the kind of confidence that comes from never having been truly tested by life. And I smiled. You know what, Veronica? You're absolutely right about one thing. Nobody around here knows the real me. Veronica blinked, clearly expecting tears or anger or some kind of emotional breakdown that would confirm her assessment of my character and provide her with the satisfaction of a complete victory. But, I continued, my voice carrying a note of anticipation that seemed to puzzle her, I think it's time that changed. In fact, I think it's time for you and everyone else in this neighborhood to learn exactly who Elena Rodriguez-Martinez really is. I picked up my coffee cup and mystery novel, rising from my porch chair with the unhurried grace of someone who had suddenly discovered they were very much looking forward to what came next. Thank you, Veronica. You've just given me the perfect opportunity to show everyone something I've been keeping private for far too long. As I turned to go inside, I could hear Veronica's heels clicking uncertainly on the pavement behind me, probably wondering why her carefully calculated cruelty hadn't produced the devastating emotional collapse she had been orchestrating for months. What Veronica didn't know, what none of them knew, was that she'd just made the biggest mistake of her life. Because Elena Rodriguez-Martinez wasn't just a lonely widow with no family and no resources. Elena Rodriguez-Martinez was about to become Meadowbrook Estates' most unforgettable lesson in the dangers of judging people by appearances. Now, before we dive deeper into how I handled Veronica's cruelty, I want to hear from you. Have you ever been in a situation where someone completely misjudged who you are? Maybe a coworker who thought you were just the quiet person in the corner, or a neighbor who assumed they knew your whole story based on what they could see from the outside. Drop your experiences in the comments. I read every single one, and some of your stories are absolutely incredible. And if you're enjoying this tale of a 74-year-old woman who's about to turn the tables on her cruel neighbor, please hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. These stories take weeks to research and craft, and your support helps me bring you more content about people who prove that you should never underestimate someone based on appearances alone. Also, I'm curious, where are you watching from today? I love seeing how these stories reach people all around the world. Whether you're having your morning coffee in Minnesota or your evening tea in Manchester, drop your location in the comments. There's something beautiful about how universal these experiences of being underestimated really are. Now, to understand the full impact of what happened next, you need to know the complete backstory of how I ended up in Meadowbrook Estates and why Veronica Sterling had made such a catastrophic error in judgment about who she was dealing with. The truth is, my life story reads like something out of a novel, and the quiet widow persona that my neighbors saw was just the final chapter of a much larger book. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to the beginning, because context is everything in a story like this. I was born Elena Maria Vasquez in 1949 in a small farming town called Esperanza Valley, about 3 hours north of where I now live in Meadowbrook Estates. My parents, Carlos and Isabela Vasquez, had immigrated from Mexico in the 1940s as part of the Bracero program, initially working as seasonal agricultural laborers before eventually saving enough money to lease their own small farm. Growing up, we had very little in terms of material possessions, but we had something infinitely more valuable. We had family. Not just my immediate family, but an extended network of aunts, uncles, cousins, and family friends who formed a tight-knit community within the larger farming town. Every Sunday, our small house would fill with relatives sharing meals, stories, and the kind of deep connection that comes from people who truly understand each other's struggles and dreams. My childhood was shaped by hard work, strong values, and the absolute certainty that family always came first. My mother taught me to cook traditional recipes that had been passed down through generations. My father taught me that education was the pathway to opportunities he'd never had. My grandmother, Abuela Rosa, taught me that strength often wore the disguise of gentleness and that the most powerful people were often the ones who spoke the softest. I was the first person in my family to graduate from high school, and definitely the first to go to college. In 1967, I earned a scholarship to Westfield State University, where I majored in elementary education with a minor in Spanish literature. It was there, during my junior year, that I met Miguel Antonio Rodriguez-Martinez. Miguel was studying engineering and working 2 part-time jobs to pay for school, one at a local auto repair shop where he'd learned to fix anything with an engine, and another at the university library where he'd developed his love of reading and quiet spaces. He was handsome in an understated way, with gentle hands that were equally skilled at rebuilding carburetors and turning the pages of poetry books. Our courtship was old-fashioned and sweet. Study dates in the library, long walks around campus talking about our dreams and plans, careful introductions to each other's families. Miguel's family had a similar background to mine, hardworking immigrants who'd built a life through determination and mutual support. When we married in 1971, it felt like the joining of 2 rivers that had been flowing toward the same destination all along. The early years of our marriage were lean but happy. I taught 3rd grade at Riverside Elementary School in Westfield County, while Miguel worked as a junior engineer for the county's Public Works Department. We rented a small apartment and saved every penny we could, dreaming of the day when we could buy our own home and start the family we both wanted. In 1976, we finally had enough money for a down payment on a modest house in what was then a working-class neighborhood that would eventually become Meadowbrook Estates. The house was a fixer-upper that had been on the market for months because it needed so much work. New plumbing, electrical updates, roof repairs, and cosmetic improvements throughout. But Miguel saw potential where others saw problems, and I saw the possibility of creating something beautiful together. We spent the next 3 years transforming that house into our dream home. Miguel's engineering background and mechanical skills meant he could handle most of the technical work himself, while I focused on design, gardening, and the thousand small details that turn a house into a home. Every weekend was a new project, refinishing hardwood floors, installing built-in bookcases, designing the garden that would become my passion for the next 4 decades. But the most important transformation during those years wasn't to the house, it was to our family. In 1978, we welcomed our daughter Carmen, followed by our son Diego in 1980, and our youngest daughter, Sophia, in 1983. Suddenly, our quiet house was filled with the beautiful chaos of childhood. Toys scattered across hand-refinished floors, artwork covering hand-painted walls, laughter echoing through rooms that Miguel and I had built with our own hands. Those were the golden years, when Meadowbrook Estates was still a neighborhood rather than a community, when families knew each other's children by name and borrowed tools over back fences. Carmen, Diego, and Sofia grew up with a pack of neighborhood kids who moved between houses like an extended family, showing up for dinner wherever they happened to be when the streetlights came on. I continued teaching at Riverside Elementary, eventually becoming the lead teacher for the bilingual education program. Miguel was promoted to senior engineer and then department supervisor, overseeing infrastructure projects throughout the county. We were living the American dream that our parents had sacrificed to make possible for us. But what none of our neighbors knew, what I never talked about, even with close friends, was that our American dream was just one part of a much larger family story that stretched across 2 countries and multiple generations. You see, both Miguel and I came from families that had maintained strong connections to Mexico, even after immigrating to the United States. We weren't just Mexican Americans who happened to have relatives south of the border. We were part of extended family networks that traded the international border as a minor inconvenience rather than a permanent separation. Miguel's oldest brother, Roberto, had returned to Mexico in the 1960s and become enormously successful in the construction business, eventually building one of the largest commercial development companies in the state of Jalisco. Roberto had married a woman from a prominent business family, and together they'd raised 5 children who were now successful professionals in their own right: doctors, lawyers, engineers, and business owners. My sister Carmen, my daughter was named after her, had also returned to Mexico after college, where she'd married into a family that owned a chain of hotels throughout the Pacific Coast region. Her husband's family had welcomed her completely, and she'd spent the past 30 years helping to expand their business into one of the most successful hospitality companies in Western Mexico. But the most remarkable story belonged to my youngest brother, Francisco, who had joined the Mexican diplomatic service in the 1970s and spent his career representing Mexico in embassies around the world. Francisco had married a colleague from the foreign ministry, and together they'd raised 3 children while living in countries across Europe, Asia, and South America. When Francisco retired from diplomatic service in 2010, he'd been appointed to a senior position in Mexico's Ministry of Tourism, where he was responsible for promoting cultural exchange programs between Mexico and the United States. These weren't distant relatives we exchanged Christmas cards with once a year. These were active, ongoing relationships that had shaped our lives in countless ways throughout our marriage. Miguel and I traveled to Mexico at least twice a year, hosting elaborate family reunions at Roberto's ranch in Jalisco or Carmen's beach house in Puerto Vallarta. Our children grew up bilingual and bicultural, spending summers with their Mexican cousins and considering Mexico as much their home as Meadowbrook Estates. When Carmen, Diego, and Sofia went to college, they each spent semesters studying abroad. Not just anywhere, but specifically in Mexico, staying with family and working in family businesses to understand their heritage in deeper ways.
Carmen eventually became a successful architect with her own firm. Diego became a pediatric surgeon, and Sofia became an international business consultant specializing in Latin American markets. But here's the part that would have shocked my Meadowbrook Estates neighbors. All three of my children had ultimately chosen to build their primary careers and families in Mexico rather than the United States. Carmen had married a wonderful man she met while studying architecture in Mexico City, and together they'd established an architectural firm that specialized in sustainable resort development. They lived in a beautiful home in San Miguel de Allende and had 4 children who spoke perfect English and Spanish and considered their American grandmother an essential part of their lives. Diego had completed his medical training in the United States, but chose to establish his practice in Guadalajara, where he could serve both affluent patients who paid for premium care and low-income children through a charity clinic he'd founded with his wife Maria, who was also a pediatric surgeon. They had 3 children and lived in a compound that included a guest house specifically designed for when Miguel and I visited.
Sofia had built an international consulting business that allowed her to live anywhere, but she'd chosen to base herself in Mexico City, where her husband Carlos ran a sustainable agriculture company that worked with small farmers throughout central Mexico. They had 2 children and maintained homes in both Mexico City and a rural area where Carlos's agricultural projects were based. So while my Meadowbrook Estates neighbors saw a quiet widow who lived alone and had no apparent family connections, the reality was that I was the matriarch of a large, successful, international family that included successful business owners, medical professionals, diplomats, and community leaders across 2 countries. The reason none of my neighbors knew this wasn't because I was secretive or ashamed. It was because they'd never asked, and I'd never felt the need to educate people who showed no genuine interest in my life beyond how my property values might affect their own. Miguel and I had made a conscious decision early in our marriage to maintain our privacy about our family success and international connections. We'd seen how differently people treated families once they knew about wealth or prominence, and we preferred relationships based on genuine connection rather than social calculation. In Meadowbrook Estates, we were simply the quiet couple who maintained a beautiful garden and minded their own business. Our neighbors knew that Miguel was an engineer and I was a teacher, that we traveled occasionally, and that we seemed content with our modest lifestyle. What they didn't know was that our modest lifestyle was a choice rather than a limitation, and that our occasional travels included things like private beach houses, family compounds, and business conferences in 5-star resorts. When Miguel died suddenly 6 years ago, I could have easily moved to Mexico to be closer to my children and grandchildren. In fact, all 3 of my children begged me to do exactly that. Carmen had a mother-in-law suite in her San Miguel de Allende home that she designed specifically for when Miguel and I decided to retire to Mexico. Diego and Maria had built their guest house with the assumption that I'd eventually move there permanently. Sofia had offered to buy me a home in Mexico City where I could be close to her family and the cultural activities I'd always enjoyed. But I chose to stay in Meadowbrook Estates for several reasons. First, this house represented 42 years of memories with Miguel, and I wasn't ready to leave the place where we'd been happiest together. Second, my volunteer work at the Westfield County Library was genuinely fulfilling, and I felt I was making a meaningful contribution to my local community. Third, I enjoyed the independence of maintaining my own home and routines without being the visiting mother who disrupted anyone else's household dynamics. Most importantly, I stayed because I could. My financial situation was far more secure than anyone realized. Miguel's engineering career had provided excellent benefits and retirement savings. My teacher's pension was modest but reliable. The house was paid off completely. And though this was something I'd never discussed with anyone, Miguel and I had made smart investments over the years that had grown substantially, particularly some early investments in technology stocks that Miguel's brother Roberto had recommended based on his business connections. Additionally, both Miguel and I had inherited money when our parents died.
Not huge amounts individually, but when combined with our savings and investments, enough to ensure that I could live comfortably for the rest of my life without financial worry. I could afford to maintain the house, take care of any medical needs that arose, and travel to see my family as often as I wanted. But beyond the financial security, there was another reason I stayed that would have surprised my neighbors even more than my family connections. I was actually quite content with my solitary life in Meadowbrook Estates. I enjoyed my routines, my garden, my volunteer work, and the peaceful predictability of my days. I had meaningful relationships with people at the library, regular video calls with my children and grandchildren, and the deep satisfaction that comes from a life well lived and purposefully chosen. I wasn't a lonely widow desperately in need of companionship. I was a woman who had loved deeply, raised successful children, contributed to my community, and chosen to spend her later years exactly as she pleased. The fact that my choices looked modest from the outside was irrelevant to me because I knew the truth about my resources, my options, and my reasons for living the way I did. This is what made Veronica Sterling's campaign of harassment so particularly misguided. She'd constructed an elaborate fantasy about my life based on superficial observations and assumptions, then used that fantasy to justify increasingly cruel behavior towards someone she'd decided was weak and friendless. What Veronica didn't understand was that my weakness was actually strength. The strength that comes from being secure enough in yourself that you don't need to prove anything to people whose opinions don't matter to you. My friendlessness was actually selectivity, the luxury of choosing quality relationships over social networking. My modest lifestyle was actually freedom, the freedom that comes from having enough resources that you can live exactly as you choose rather than as others expect. But the most dangerous part of Veronica's miscalculation was her assumption that I was isolated and defenseless. The truth was that I had a support network that spanned 2 countries and included some genuinely powerful and influential people. I just chose not to mention it because I'd never needed to use it. Until now.
The morning after Veronica told me to just die already, I sat in my kitchen with my coffee and began making a series of phone calls that would change everything in Meadowbrook Estates. Not because I was vindictive or petty, but because Veronica had finally pushed far enough that I decided it was time for my neighbors to learn who they'd been living next to for the past 42 years. The first call was to my daughter, Carmen, in San Miguel de Allende. It was 6 a.m. my time, which made it 5 a.m. her time, but I knew she'd be awake. She'd inherited my early rising habits and always started her days with yoga and coffee before her children woke up. "Mama!" Carmen's voice was bright despite the early hour. "How wonderful to hear from you. Is everything all right?" "Everything is fine, mija, but I'm calling because I've decided it's time for something I've been considering for a while. How would you and the family feel about spending Thanksgiving here in Meadowbrook Estates this year?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. For the past 6 years, since Miguel's death, I'd spent every major holiday in Mexico with my children and grandchildren. The idea of them coming to the United States for Thanksgiving was unprecedented. "Of course we'd love that, Mama. But are you sure? That's a lot of work for you, hosting everyone in the house." "I'm sure, Carmen. In fact, I'm more sure about this than I've been about anything in a long time. How many people are we talking about? You and Miguel and the 4 children, obviously. Do you think Diego and Sophia's families could come too?" "Let me check with them, but I think they'd be thrilled. Diego was just saying last week that the children need to spend more time in the United States to keep their English sharp. And Sophia's been wanting to visit some business contacts in this region. I think we could make it work." "Wonderful. And Carmen, I want you to plan to stay for at least a week. Maybe longer. I know that's a lot to arrange with work and school, but I have my reasons." "Of course, Mama. We'll make it work. Should we book hotels in town or—" "Absolutely not.
Everyone stays here with me. I'll figure out the sleeping arrangements. This is going to be a proper family Thanksgiving in the house where you all grew up. After I hung up with Carmen, I called Diego in Guadalajara. He was just finishing his morning run and was equally surprised but delighted by the invitation. The children have been asking when they can see Abuela's house again, and Maria has been wanting to meet your neighbors. She's curious about this famous American suburban life we're always describing. The call to Sofia in Mexico City was the most interesting because Sofia had inherited my gift for reading between the lines of family conversations. "Mama," she said after I had extended the invitation, "this is wonderful. But I'm sensing there's more to this story. Is everything all right? Has something happened?" "Nothing's wrong, mija. But let's say I've decided it's time for my neighbors to meet the family they've never bothered to ask about." Sophia was quiet for a moment, then laughed. "Oh, Mama, what has someone done now?" "Let's just say that someone has made some very unfortunate assumptions about my circumstances, and I think a family gathering might provide some useful clarification." I can't wait to hear this story. And yes, of course we'll come. Carlos has some business in Texas the week after Thanksgiving anyway, so the timing is perfect. By the end of the morning, I'd confirmed that all 3 of my children and their families would be coming to Meadowbrook Estates for Thanksgiving. In total, we were looking at 14 people. My 3 children and their spouses, plus 8 grandchildren ranging in age from 7 to 22. But I wasn't done making calls. The next call was to my brother Francisco at the Ministry of Tourism in Mexico City. Francisco had retired from active diplomacy, but still maintained an office and staff as a senior advisor on cultural exchange programs. "Elena, what a pleasant surprise! How are you, hermana?" "I'm well, Francisco, but I'm calling because I need some advice about something." I explained the situation with Veronica, her harassment campaign, and her assumption that I was an isolated, elderly woman with no family or resources. Francisco listened with the diplomatic patience that had served him well throughout his career, asking clarifying questions and taking notes. "This is quite extraordinary," he said when I finished. "Not just the harassment, but the level of cultural ignorance involved. This woman has been living across the street from you for 2 years and has never bothered to learn anything about your background or family." "That's correct. And Francisco, I'm calling because I don't want you to intervene officially. I'm calling because I want to make sure I understand my options if this situation escalates further." "Of course. Let me think about this. Elena, you know that both the Mexican consulate in Los Angeles and the Consul General's office maintain community liaison programs specifically designed to assist Mexican-American families with exactly these kinds of cultural sensitivity issues." "I didn't know that." "Oh, yes. In fact, there are established protocols for addressing discrimination against Mexican-American citizens, particularly elderly women who might be targeted because they're perceived as vulnerable. The Consul General would be very interested in this situation."
Francisco paused, and I could hear him typing on his computer. "Elena, I'm looking at some recent initiatives that might be relevant here. There's a new program promoting cultural exchange and family reunification activities specifically in suburban American communities. Would you be interested in hosting an official cultural exchange event? Something that would highlight the contributions of Mexican-American families to their local communities?" "That sounds very interesting, Francisco. I'll make some calls. This could be an excellent opportunity to showcase exactly the kind of cross-cultural family success story that both governments want to promote. And it would certainly provide some context for your neighbors about who they've been living next to."
The final call of the morning was to my nephew, Roberto Jr., who lived in Los Angeles and worked as an entertainment industry lawyer. Roberto Jr. was Roberto Sr.'s eldest son and had inherited his father's business acumen along with a law degree from Stanford. He specialized in representing high-profile Latino celebrities and business owners in contract negotiations and cultural sensitivity disputes. Tia Elena, how wonderful to hear from you. Dad said to tell you that the family reunion planning for Christmas is going wonderfully. We're expecting almost 50 people this year. That sounds lovely, Roberto. But I'm actually calling about something else entirely. I explained the situation with Veronica, and Roberto Jr. listened with the kind of focused attention that successful lawyers bring to potential legal issues. Tia, what you're describing could constitute harassment and possibly discrimination based on age and national origin. Has this woman made any specifically anti-Mexican comments or references to your immigration status? Not directly, but there have been implications about whether I belong in this neighborhood, and comments about my gardening style being inappropriate for American suburbs. Interesting. And you said she's been filing false complaints with code enforcement. Yes, multiple times. The city has investigated and found no violations, but she keeps calling. That could constitute abuse of government processes, which is actually a misdemeanor in your county. Thea, I think you should start documenting everything: dates, times, witnesses, copies of any written communications. You may need that information later. I've been keeping records, Roberto. Old teacher habit. Excellent. And Tia Elena, if this escalates further, or if you decide you want to take formal action, I know several excellent attorneys in your area who specialize in exactly these kinds of cases. But for now, it sounds like you have a much more elegant solution in mind. What do you mean? Roberto Jr. laughed. Tia, I've known you my whole life. You're planning something that's going to teach this woman a lesson she'll never forget, aren't you? Let's just say that Thanksgiving this year is going to be very educational for everyone in Meadowbrook Estates. By noon, I'd set in motion a series of events that would completely transform the dynamics in my neighborhood. My family was coming for Thanksgiving, my brother was arranging possible cultural exchange activities through official diplomatic channels, and my nephew was standing by with legal resources if the situation required escalation. But the most important thing I'd accomplished was shifting my own mindset from reactive to proactive. For 2 years, I'd allowed Veronica Sterling to dictate the terms of our conflict, responding to her attacks with patience and diplomacy. Now, finally, it was time to show her what she'd actually been dealing with all along. Veronica thought she was harassing a lonely, powerless elderly woman. She was about to discover that she had systematically bullied the beloved matriarch of one of the most successful Mexican-American families in 2 countries, a family that included business owners, medical professionals, diplomats, and lawyers who took family loyalty very seriously indeed. The best part? Everything I was planning was completely legal, perfectly reasonable, and exactly the kind of cultural celebration that any normal neighbor would welcome and appreciate. Everything, that is, except for the part where Veronica Sterling was about to have to face the truth about her own ignorance, prejudice, and cruelty in front of the entire community she'd been trying so hard to impress. Thanksgiving was still 3 weeks away, but my real preparations were just beginning. The 3 weeks between my morning of phone calls and Thanksgiving were some of the most interesting of my entire retirement. It's fascinating how much you can observe about people when you know they're about to be completely blindsided by reality. Watching Veronica Sterling during those weeks was like watching someone confidently walk toward a cliff while insisting the ground ahead was perfectly solid. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you about how those 3 weeks unfolded, because the build-up to Thanksgiving was almost as satisfying as the revelation itself. The first sign that things were shifting came 2 days after my phone calls, when I received a formal letter from the Mexican consulate in Los Angeles. The envelope was heavy cream-colored paper with official seals, and it arrived by special courier rather than regular mail. I was on my front porch having my morning coffee when the courier arrived, and I couldn't help but notice Veronica's white Tesla pulling into her driveway at exactly the same moment.
Veronica clearly noticed the official nature of the delivery because she lingered by her car, pretending to organize items in her purse while obviously trying to get a better look at what was happening on my front porch. The courier was professional and efficient, asking me to sign for the delivery and confirming my identity before handing over the envelope. "Good morning, Mrs. Rodriguez-Martinez. I have an official communication from the Consulate General of Mexico in Los Angeles. Please sign here to confirm receipt." I signed the electronic tablet with a flourish, thanking the courier in both English and Spanish. As he walked back to his official vehicle, which bore diplomatic plates and the Mexican flag emblem, I could see Veronica straining to read the markings from across the street. The letter itself was everything my brother Francisco had promised. It was an official invitation to participate in a new cultural exchange program called Celebrating Mexican-American Family Success Stories, which would involve hosting official representatives from the Mexican government during a family heritage celebration that would be documented for cultural exchange materials used by both the Mexican Ministry of Tourism and the U.S. State Department. The letter specifically mentioned that my family had been selected based on our outstanding example of successful cultural integration while maintaining strong family traditions and international connections. It noted that my brother Francisco had provided the highest possible recommendation for our family's participation in this diplomatic initiative. But the most interesting part of the letter was the paragraph explaining that the celebration would include official documentation by diplomatic cultural attachés and would be shared with local community leaders as an example of the positive contributions Mexican-American families make to American suburban communities. In other words, not only was my family coming for Thanksgiving, but we would be hosting official representatives from the Mexican government who would be documenting our celebration as an example of successful Mexican-American family achievement. The letter requested that I inform my local community leadership about the cultural exchange event so they could, quote, participate in this opportunity to learn about Mexican-American family traditions. I read the letter twice, then looked across the street where Veronica was still pretending to organize her purse, while clearly trying to process what she'd observed. I waved cheerfully and called out, "Beautiful morning, isn't it, Veronica?" She gave me a tight smile and hurried into her house, probably to spend the morning speculating about why I was receiving official diplomatic correspondence. The next development came that afternoon, when I called the president of our homeowners association, a reasonable man named Harold Peterson, who lived 3 streets over and had always been professional in our limited interactions. "Hello, Harold. This is Elena Rodriguez-Martinez from Maple Ridge Drive. I wanted to inform you about an event I'll be hosting next month that might be of interest to the association." "Of course, Elena. What kind of event?" "My family will be visiting for Thanksgiving, and we've been selected to participate in a cultural exchange program through the Mexican consulate. We'll be hosting representatives from the Mexican government who will be documenting our celebration as part of a diplomatic initiative promoting understanding of Mexican-American family contributions to American communities." There was a pause while Harold processed this information. "That sounds quite prestigious, Elena. How many people are we talking about?" "Approximately 14 family members, plus the diplomatic representatives. Everyone will be staying at my house, so there won't be any impact on neighborhood parking or facilities. But the consulate has requested that I inform local community leadership in case anyone would like to participate in the cultural exchange aspects of the event." "This is fascinating, Elena. I had no idea you had such extensive family connections. Would it be appropriate for me to mention this to the other board members? This sounds like exactly the kind of positive community recognition that reflects well on Meadowbrook Estates."
Of course, Harold. I'll send you the official documentation from the consulate so you have all the details. After I hung up with Harold, I sat back in my kitchen chair and smiled. By evening, Harold would have shared this information with the other board members. By tomorrow, it would be circulating through the informal communication networks. And by the end of the week, everyone in Meadowbrook Estates would know that the Quiet Widow at 1247 Maple Ridge Drive was hosting an official diplomatic cultural exchange event. Everyone except Veronica Sterling, who apparently was not part of the neighborhood communication networks she thought she controlled. The third development came on Friday, when I received a phone call from Carmen with an update on the family's travel plans. Mama, everyone is so excited about this Thanksgiving, but I wanted to check with you about something. Miguel's architecture firm has a project in San Antonio that he needs to visit the week before Thanksgiving, so he was wondering if it would be all right for him to come a few days early. He could help you with preparations and also get some work done.
That would be wonderful, mija. What kind of work? He's designing a resort complex, and he wants to take some photographs of American suburban architecture for comparison purposes. He's particularly interested in how landscape design integrates with residential architecture in gated communities like yours. I almost laughed out loud. My son-in-law Miguel was one of Mexico's most successful resort architects, specializing in luxury developments that attracted wealthy international clients. His research into American suburban architecture would involve him walking around Meadowbrook Estates with professional camera equipment, documenting everything from garden design to architectural details.
That sounds perfect, Carmen. He's welcome to use the house as his base for the research. Wonderful. And Mama, Diego wanted me to ask you about something too. He's been invited to give a presentation at the medical conference in Dallas the week after Thanksgiving about the charitable clinic he and Maria run in Guadalajara. Would it be possible for him to extend his visit and prepare for the presentation while he's staying with you? Of course. What kind of presentation? It's for the American Association of Pediatric Surgeons. They want him to speak about innovative approaches to providing pediatric surgical care in underserved communities. The presentation will include statistics about patient outcomes and cost-effectiveness that he thinks will interest American medical professionals. So, my son, the pediatric surgeon, would be spending extra time in Meadowbrook Estates preparing a presentation for one of the most prestigious medical associations in the United States about the internationally recognized charitable clinic he'd founded in Mexico. And Sophia? I asked. Oh, Sophia is bringing the most interesting addition to our visit. You know her consulting business works with sustainable agriculture companies, right? Well, she's been invited to speak at a conference in Chicago about sustainable farming initiatives that support both economic development and environmental protection. She's bringing materials from some of her most successful projects to share with American business leaders. How lovely! But here's the really exciting part, Mama. Sophia's husband, Carlos, is bringing samples of the organic products his company produces. Coffee, chocolate, artisanal foods, because some American importers have expressed interest in carrying his products. He's hoping to set up some business meetings while we're visiting. So, my youngest daughter, the international business consultant, would be preparing for a presentation about sustainable development, while her husband, who owned one of Mexico's most successful organic agriculture companies, would be conducting business meetings with American importers. The picture that was emerging was even more impressive than I originally planned. My family wasn't just successful, they were the kind of successful that gets invited to international conferences and pursued by American business partners. Carmen, this is all wonderful. Please tell everyone that they should treat this visit as a working vacation. Whatever they need to accomplish, we'll make sure they have space and time to do it properly. Thank you, Mama. Oh, and one more thing. Francisco called me yesterday about the cultural exchange documentation. Did you know that the cultural attaché who will be photographing our celebration is also a filmmaker? She's working on a documentary about successful Mexican-American families for broadcast on both Mexican and American television. That's interesting.
Francisco thinks our family would be perfect for the documentary because we represent 3 generations of successful cultural integration. He said the filmmaker is particularly interested in families where the second and third generation have chosen to maintain strong connections to Mexico while also contributing to American communities. How thoughtful of Francisco to think of us, Mama. And I can hear the smile in her voice. I get the feeling there's more to the story than you're telling me. Has something happened that made you decide it was time for your neighbors to meet your family? Let's just say that someone made some unfortunate assumptions about my circumstances, and I decided it was time to provide some clarification. Oh, this is going to be so much fun. Miguel and I are already planning what to bring for Thanksgiving dinner. Did you know that Miguel's specialty Tres Leches take won a prize at the Culinary Arts Festival in San Miguel de Allende last year?
I didn't know that.
And Diego's wife Maria makes the most incredible mole poblano using a recipe that's been in her family for 6 generations. Sofia is bringing her special Mexican hot chocolate blend that Carlos's company produces exclusively for high-end restaurants. It sounds like we're going to have quite a feast. Mama, by the time we're finished with this Thanksgiving celebration, your neighbors are going to think they're living next door to Mexican royalty. After I hung up with Carmen, I sat in my kitchen contemplating the magnitude of what was about to happen. My family wasn't just visiting for Thanksgiving. They were bringing their professional achievements, their business connections, their award-winning culinary skills, and their international success stories. And all of this would be happening under the official documentation of the Mexican consulate, with diplomatic representatives filming everything for educational purposes. But the most delicious part was that none of this was fabricated or exaggerated. This was simply my actual family being themselves, bringing their real lives and authentic achievements to Meadowbrook Estates for a traditional family holiday.
The following week brought the next phase of developments, when Miguel arrived to begin his architectural research. I picked him up at the airport on Tuesday morning, and from the moment he stepped off the plane, it was clear that this visit was going to exceed even my expectations. Miguel Rodriguez Sandoval was a tall, distinguished man in his early 50s, with silver hair and the kind of quiet confidence that comes from genuine professional success. He dressed like the international architect he was, expensive but understated clothing, European eyeglasses, and a leather portfolio that had clearly traveled to many countries. But what really distinguished Miguel was his approach to everything he did. When he said he wanted to research American suburban architecture, he meant it seriously. He'd brought professional camera equipment, measurement tools, and notebooks filled with technical observations about residential design principles. Abuela Helena, he said as we drove through Meadowbrook Estates toward my house, this community is fascinating. The integration of landscape design with residential architecture is much more sophisticated than I expected. And the uniformity of maintenance standards creates a very cohesive aesthetic experience. He was taking notes as we drove, commenting on everything from the street lighting design to the way the entrance gates created a sense of arrival and exclusivity. Would it be possible for me to walk through the neighborhood with my camera equipment? I'd like to document some of these design approaches for comparison with resort communities I'm developing in Mexico. Of course, Miguel. You're welcome to photograph whatever interests you. That afternoon, I watched from my front porch as Miguel began his systematic documentation of Meadowbrook Estates. He worked with the methodical precision of a professional, setting up tripods for detailed shots, taking measurements, and making technical notes about everything from garden design to architectural proportions. The reaction from my neighbors was immediate and intense. People who had rarely paid attention to my property were suddenly very interested in what was happening on Maple Ridge Drive. I could see curtains twitching in windows, neighbors finding excuses to check their mailboxes or walk their dogs past my house, and at least 3 people stopping to ask Miguel about his work.
Miguel was charming and professional with everyone who approached him, explaining that he was documenting American residential design for comparison with international resort development projects. He had business cards from his architecture firm, and he spoke about his work with the kind of casual expertise that made it clear he was very successful at what he did. But what really interested me was Veronica Sterling. On Wednesday afternoon, I was in my kitchen preparing dinner when I saw Veronica march across the street and approach Miguel, who was photographing the integration between my garden design and the house's architectural elements. I couldn't hear the conversation from inside, but I could see the body language. Veronica started with her typical aggressive posture, hands on hips, chin raised, clearly demanding an explanation for Miguel's presence in her neighborhood. Miguel responded with polite attention, showing him his camera equipment and apparently explaining his project. But then something shifted. Miguel pulled out his phone and showed Veronica something, probably images of his resort projects. Her posture changed completely. The aggressive stance melted into something much more deferential, and she began asking questions instead of making demands. The conversation lasted about 15 minutes, with Veronica becoming increasingly animated and Miguel remaining politely professional. When they finally parted, Veronica practically skipped back to her house, while Miguel shook his head slightly and returned to his work. That evening, Miguel told me about the encounter over dinner. "Your neighbor across the street is quite something, Abuela Helena. She started by questioning my right to be photographing in her neighborhood, but when I showed her images of the resort projects I've designed, her entire attitude changed." "How so?" "I became very interested in the property values of those resorts and whether I thought Meadowbrook Estates had similar investment potential. She also asked a lot of questions about my business and whether I was planning to develop any projects in this area." "What did you tell her?" "I told her the truth, that I was here visiting my wife's family and conducting research. But I also mentioned that my firm often collaborates with American developers on luxury resort projects and that I was impressed with the quality of residential design in this community." "How did she respond to that?" "She invited me and Carmen to dinner at her house this weekend. She wants to learn more about international architecture and investment opportunities. She's hoping I might have business connections that could benefit her somehow." I almost choked on my coffee. Veronica Sterling, who had spent 2 years telling me I was a pathetic old woman with no family or connections, was now trying to network with my son-in-law because she'd discovered he was a successful international architect. "Are you going to accept her invitation?" "I think I should, don't you? It would be impolite to refuse. And Carmen will enjoy meeting your neighbors." The irony was exquisite. Veronica was so focused on Miguel's professional success that she hadn't bothered to ask basic questions about his family connections. She had no idea that the distinguished international architect she was trying to impress was married to the daughter of the pathetic old woman she had been systematically harassing.
Friday brought another fascinating development when Diego arrived with his wife Maria and their 3 children. Diego Rodriguez-Martinez was everything you'd expect from a successful pediatric surgeon. Calm, confident, and radiating the kind of quiet authority that comes from spending your days making life and death decisions. But what made Diego particularly impressive was his passion for his work. Within an hour of arriving at my house, he was showing me photographs and statistics from the charitable clinic he and Maria had founded in Guadalajara, explaining how they provided free pediatric surgical care to children whose families couldn't afford private medical treatment. "We've performed over 2,000 surgeries in the past 5 years, Diego explained, pulling up data on his laptop. "Our patient outcomes are actually better than many private hospitals because we focus exclusively on pediatric cases, and we use the most current surgical techniques." "That's remarkable, Diego." The really exciting part is that we're starting to attract international attention. The presentation I'm giving in Dallas next week will include data that shows how our model could be replicated in other countries, including the United States. Maria, who was equally accomplished, added,
We've been invited to consult on similar projects in Guatemala and Colombia. There's growing recognition that our approach to combining high-quality medical care with community outreach is very effective. That weekend, Diego joined Miguel in his neighborhood research project, but with a different focus. Diego was interested in American suburban family life from a public health perspective, particularly how community design affects children's physical and social development. In Mexico, we're seeing increasing rates of childhood obesity and social isolation, similar to what happened in American suburbs 20 years ago. I'm interested in understanding how communities like this one have evolved to address those problems. So now I had two accomplished professionals conducting research in Meadowbrook Estates, one documenting architectural and landscape design principles, the other studying community health and family lifestyle factors. The reaction from my neighbors was even more intense than it had been when Miguel arrived alone. People were clearly curious about who these sophisticated visitors were and why they were so interested in our neighborhood. I began receiving phone calls from neighbors I'd barely spoken to in years, asking casual questions about my guests and their research projects. But the most significant reaction came on Sunday morning when Veronica Sterling knocked on my front door. I was in my kitchen preparing breakfast when I heard the knock. Through the window, I could see Veronica standing on my front porch wearing what was clearly her most expensive outfit: a designer dress, professional heels, and jewelry that probably cost more than most people's monthly mortgage payments. "Good morning, Veronica," I said when I opened the door. "How can I help you?" "Elena, I wanted to apologize for any misunderstandings we may have had in the past. I think there may have been some communication issues between us, and I'd like to clear the air." This was fascinating. Veronica Sterling, who told me to just die already less than 3 weeks ago, was standing on my front porch apologizing for misunderstandings. "That's very thoughtful of you, Veronica. Would you like to come in for coffee?" "Thank you, but I can't stay long. I just wanted to say that I've met your son-in-law, Miguel, and he's such an impressive man. And I understand your son, Diego, is a doctor? I had no idea you had such accomplished family members." "Yes, I'm very proud of my children." "Well, I hope you know that if there's ever anything you need, help with errands or maintenance or anything at all, I hope you'll feel comfortable asking. We're neighbors after all, and neighbors should support each other." "That's very kind of you, Veronica." After Veronica left, I sat in my kitchen marveling at the complete transformation in her attitude. 3 weeks ago, she'd been campaigning to drive me out of the neighborhood. Now she was offering to help with my errands. But the most telling part of her visit was what she hadn't said. Despite spending 15 minutes apologizing for misunderstandings and expressing interest in my family's accomplishments, Veronica never directly acknowledged her previous behavior or took responsibility for the cruel things she had said. Instead, she was trying to rewrite history, transforming her harassment campaign into communication issues and her cruelty into wrong impressions. She was hoping to network her way into my family's success without ever acknowledging the prejudice and assumptions that had shaped her behavior. It was a masterclass in the kind of social manipulation that people like Veronica use to avoid accountability while positioning themselves to benefit from situations they initially tried to destroy. But Veronica Sterling had no idea what was really coming.
Because while she was busy trying to apologize for misunderstandings, I was finalizing preparations for a Thanksgiving celebration that would provide the entire neighborhood with the complete education about who their quiet neighbor really was. And unlike Veronica's version of history, my family story would be documented by official diplomatic representatives and filmed for educational purposes. The truth, as they say, has a way of making itself known. The week before Thanksgiving brought developments that even I, with all my careful planning, hadn't anticipated. It's one thing to orchestrate a family reunion that will educate your neighbors about their assumptions. It's quite another to watch those same neighbors reveal the true depths of their character when they think opportunity is knocking at their door.
What happened with Veronica Sterling during those final 7 days before my family arrived was so outrageous, so presumptuous, and so perfectly calculated to backfire that I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. It started on Monday morning when I was in my garden, deadheading the last chrysanthemums of the season. The November air was crisp and clear, perfect for the kind of methodical outdoor work that helped me think through the final details of Thanksgiving week. Miguel and Diego had returned to Mexico briefly to handle business matters before the official family gathering, leaving me with a few days of blessed quiet to prepare. I was kneeling beside my flower bed, enjoying the meditative rhythm of garden maintenance, when I heard the click of expensive heels on pavement. I looked up to see Veronica Sterling approaching, but this wasn't the casual neighborly visit I'd experienced the previous weekend. This was Veronica in full business mode. Designer blazer, professional makeup, and a leather portfolio that suggested she had serious matters to discuss. "Elena, I hope I'm not interrupting anything important," she said, though her tone suggested she didn't particularly care if she was. "Just some garden cleanup, Veronica. What can I do for you?" "I was hoping we could talk about some exciting opportunities I think might interest your family. Do you have a few minutes?" I stood slowly, brushing dirt from my gardening gloves while studying Veronica's expression. She had the focused intensity of someone who'd convinced herself she was about to make a profitable deal. "Of course. Would you like to sit on the porch?" "That would be perfect." We settled into the wicker chairs on my front porch, and Veronica immediately opened her portfolio with the practiced efficiency of someone accustomed to making presentations. "Elena, I've been thinking about our conversation last weekend and about the impressive professional accomplishments of your family members. I believe there might be some mutually beneficial business opportunities we should explore." "What kind of opportunities?" She pulled out a folder filled with real estate listings, architectural photographs, and what appeared to be financial projections. "Well, as you know, I have significant experience in luxury property development and investment, and from what Miguel told me about his resort architecture work, it seems that our skill sets might complement each other very well." I blinked slowly, processing the audacity of what Veronica was suggesting. 2 weeks after telling me to just die already, she was now proposing business partnerships with my family. "I'm not sure I understand, Veronica." "Let me be more specific. I've been researching luxury resort development opportunities in this region, and I think there's enormous potential for the right kind of project. When Miguel mentioned that his firm collaborates with American developers, it occurred to me that we could create something really special together." She opened the folder and spread several documents across the small table between our chairs. "Look at these comparable properties. Luxury resorts in similar markets are generating enormous returns for investors, and with Miguel's international design expertise and my knowledge of American luxury markets, we could create something truly extraordinary." I picked up one of the financial projections, noting that it projected returns of 15 to 20% annually for resort investments in the $50 to $100 million range. "These are quite ambitious numbers, Veronica." "Exactly. And Elena, here's the really exciting part. I think your property could be the perfect location for a boutique luxury resort. You have almost 2 acres in the heart of Meadowbrook Estates, with mature landscaping and a house that could be converted into a stunning main lodge. My property?"
I want to help you maximize the potential of your assets, Elena. You're sitting on a gold mine here, and with the right development partner, you could secure your financial future while also providing your family with an incredible business opportunity. The breathtaking presumption of this proposal was almost artistic in its audacity. Veronica had spent 2 years trying to drive me out of my home because she thought I was a poor, friendless widow who was bringing down property values. Now that she discovered my family was successful, she wanted to convince me to sell that same property to her for a development project? This is certainly an interesting proposal, Veronica. Have you discussed it with Miguel? Not yet. I wanted to talk to you first, since you're the property owner, but I think he'll be very excited about the architectural possibilities. I'm sure he will be. Veronica leaned forward eagerly. Elena, I have to tell you, I've been involved in several luxury property developments over the years, and I've never seen a location with this much potential. The proximity to the airport, the upscale neighborhood, the mature landscaping, it's perfect for attracting high-end clientele. What kind of clientele? Wealthy Americans looking for sophisticated retreat experiences. International business travelers who want luxury accommodations outside the city. Affluent families celebrating special occasions. The market research shows enormous demand for exactly this type of boutique resort experience. She pulled out another set of documents, these featuring photographs of luxury resorts in other states. Look at these comparable properties. Most of them started as private estates that were converted to small luxury hotels. The owners maintained private apartments on the property while generating substantial income from the resort operations. And you think Miguel's architectural firm would be interested in designing such a project? Elena, from what Miguel told me about his work, this would be exactly the kind of project his firm specializes in. High-end resort architecture with sophisticated landscape integration? That's apparently his signature style. I nodded thoughtfully, though privately, I was marveling at how completely Veronica had misunderstood both my family's situation and Miguel's professional focus. Miguel's firm designed resorts for wealthy Mexican and international clients, with project budgets that typically started at $200 million. The idea that he would be interested in converting a suburban house into a boutique hotel showed that Veronica understood neither the scale of his work nor the financial realities of resort development. This is a lot to consider, Veronica. When would you need an answer? Well, that's the thing, Elena. I've been researching financing options, and there's a window of opportunity with some investors I know that closes at the end of December. If we're going to move forward, we'd need to have preliminary agreements in place by early January. That's very soon. I know it seems rushed, but Elena, opportunities like this don't come along often. And frankly, I think your family would be crazy not to explore this seriously. She gathered the documents back into her portfolio with the satisfied expression of someone who believed she'd just presented an irresistible opportunity. Think about it, Elena. Instead of being a retired teacher living alone in a house that's too big for you, you could be a successful resort developer with passive income and a beautiful place to live. Your children could visit a luxury resort instead of just a family home. It's a win-win situation for everyone. After Veronica left, I sat on my porch for a long time, processing the extraordinary conversation that had just taken place. In the span of 30 minutes, Veronica had revealed several things about herself that were truly remarkable. First, she still fundamentally misunderstood my financial situation. Despite meeting Miguel and Diego, despite learning about their professional success, she still assumed I needed her help to secure my financial future and maximize my assets. Second, she had no understanding of the scale or nature of my family's business activities. She thought Miguel would be excited about designing a small resort in suburban California, apparently unaware that his firm's projects typically involved entire resort cities with multiple hotels, golf courses, and commercial developments. Third, and most tellingly, she believed my family's success was something she could leverage for her own benefit. Rather than simply accepting that she'd misjudged me, she was trying to insert herself into our family's professional activities as if her previous behavior had never happened. But the most disturbing aspect of Veronica's proposal was the underlying assumption that my home was an asset I should be willing to monetize,
rather than a place where I'd built a life with my husband and raised my children. She saw my property as a development opportunity, not a family home with 42 years of memories embedded in every room and garden. That evening, I called Carmen to update her on Veronica's latest approach.
Mama, she wants to turn your house into a hotel, and she thinks Miguel would design it for her? That's correct, mija. She's convinced this would be a wonderful business opportunity for all of us. Carmen was quiet for a moment, then burst into laughter. Mama, does this woman have any idea what Miguel's firm actually does? His smallest project last year was a $300 million resort complex in Cancun. Before that, he designed the entire resort district in Costa Rica that employs over 2,000 people. I don't think she's researched his work very thoroughly. And she thinks he'd be interested in converting a suburban house into a boutique hotel. Mama, Miguel hasn't worked on anything smaller than a 50-room property in 15 years. I got the impression that scale wasn't something Veronica had considered carefully. Oh, this is getting better and better. Miguel is going to find this hilarious. Should I tell him, or do you want to surprise him? Let's let it be a surprise. I'm curious to see how Veronica approaches him with this proposal. Mama, you realize that Miguel's going to be so diplomatically polite about this that Veronica will probably think he's seriously interested, right? That possibility had occurred to me. This woman has no idea what she's walking into, does she? None whatsoever. The next morning brought another unexpected development when Harold Peterson, the HOA president, called to discuss the logistics for my family's Thanksgiving celebration. Elena, I've been thinking about the cultural exchange event you mentioned, and I wanted to make sure we're handling everything appropriately from a community standpoint. That's very thoughtful, Harold. What kinds of things are you concerned about? Well, you mentioned that representatives from the Mexican consulate would be documenting the celebration. I want to make sure that Meadowbrook Estates presents well in any official photography or videography. I'm sure it will, Harold. Our community has always been beautifully maintained. Yes, but I was thinking we might want to coordinate some kind of official community welcome for your family and the diplomatic representatives, something that shows our neighborhood's commitment to cultural understanding and international cooperation. This was an interesting development. Harold was essentially offering to organize an official HOA welcome for my family's visit, which would transform a private family gathering into a community-wide cultural exchange event. What did you have in mind, Harold? Maybe a brief welcoming ceremony when your family arrives. Nothing too formal. Just a few community representatives greeting the diplomatic visitors and perhaps presenting them with a token of appreciation from Meadowbrook Estates. That sounds lovely, though I should mention that my family's arrival is staggered over several days. Some family members are already here, others arrive tomorrow, and the rest come on Wednesday. Even better. We could have a series of informal welcomes showing how our community embraces international visitors throughout their stay. Harold, may I ask what prompted this idea? To be honest, Elena, I've been getting calls from other board members who are excited about the positive recognition this could bring to our community. Having an official diplomatic cultural exchange event documented in Meadowbrook Estates is exactly the kind of thing that enhances our reputation as a welcoming, sophisticated community. I see. And, Elena, I hope you don't mind me saying this, but several board members have mentioned how impressed they've been with your family members who are already visiting. The gentleman who's been photographing our architectural features has been very professional and courteous to everyone he's met. Miguel takes his research very seriously. It shows. And I understand your son is a doctor. Mrs. Patterson mentioned that he was asking very thoughtful questions about community health and safety features. Diego is interested in how neighborhood design affects family well-being. Fascinating. Elena, I have to admit, many of us have learned more about you and your family in the past 2 weeks than we knew in the previous 10 years. It's a reminder that we should all make more effort to get to know our neighbors better. I appreciate that, Harold. After I hung up, I reflected on the irony of Harold's comment. The community was learning about my family because they'd never bothered to ask. I'd lived in Meadowbrook Estates for 42 years.
been married to Miguel for 43 years, raised 3 children who regularly visited, and traveled frequently to Mexico to spend time with my extended family. None of this had been hidden or secret. It simply hadn't interested my neighbors enough for them to inquire about it. But now that they discovered my family was successful and sophisticated, suddenly everyone was eager to learn more and be associated with our activities. Wednesday brought the arrival of Sophia and her family, and with them a new dimension to the neighborhood's reaction to my visitors. Sofia Rodriguez Delgado was everything you'd expect from a successful international business consultant. Polished, articulate, and radiating the kind of quiet confidence that comes from regular interaction with corporate executives and government officials. But what made Sophia particularly impressive was her ability to adapt her communication style to any audience. Within hours of arriving, she was chatting comfortably with Mrs. Patterson about her grandchildren, discussing sustainable agriculture with Mr. Johnson, who maintained a small vegetable garden, and explaining international trade principles to Mrs. Chen in a way that made complex economic concepts sound fascinating rather than intimidating.
Sophia's husband Carlos was equally engaging, but in a different way. Carlos Mendoza Herrera had the practical intelligence and genuine warmth of someone who'd built a successful business by working directly with farming families throughout Mexico. He was genuinely interested in American suburban life, asking thoughtful questions about everything from home energy efficiency to local food systems. But what really set Carlos apart was his expertise in organic agriculture and sustainable food production. When he mentioned casually that his company produced coffee and chocolate for export to American specialty retailers, several neighbors became very interested in learning more about his products. "We focus on working directly with small family farms," Carlos explained to a group of neighbors who had gathered in my front yard to meet the new arrivals. "Our company provides technical support and guaranteed markets for farmers who want to transition from conventional agriculture to organic, sustainable methods." "How many farmers do you work with?" asked Mr. Johnson. "Currently, about 800 families across 6 states in Mexico. We provide them with training, certification assistance, and direct access to international markets so they can earn fair prices for premium products." "That's remarkable," said Mrs. Patterson. "What kinds of products do they grow?" "Coffee is our primary focus, but we also work with families who produce cacao for chocolate, vanilla, and various spices. The goal is to help small farmers earn sustainable incomes while producing high-quality products for international markets." Carlos pulled out his phone and showed the gathered neighbors photographs of his company's farming operations: terraced coffee plantations in mountainous regions, families harvesting cacao pods, processing facilities where raw products were transformed into export-quality goods. "Is your coffee available in the United States?" asked Mrs. Chen. "Yes, we supply several specialty retailers in California, Texas, and New York. We're actually expanding into the Pacific Northwest market next year." "What about chocolate?" "Our chocolate is carried by high-end retailers in major cities. We focus on single-origin products that highlight the unique characteristics of different growing regions." I watched this conversation with growing amazement. Carlos was casually describing a business that worked with hundreds of farming families, exported premium products to international markets, and was expanding into new American regions. Yet he was discussing it with the modest, matter-of-fact tone of someone describing a hobby rather than a multi-million-dollar enterprise. Meanwhile, Sophia was having an equally impressive conversation with another group of neighbors about her consulting work. "I help companies understand how to develop business relationships in Latin American markets. A lot of American businesses want to expand internationally, but they don't understand the cultural and regulatory differences that affect success in different countries." "What kinds of companies do you work with?" asked Harold Peterson, who had appeared as soon as he heard there were new family members to meet. "Everything from technology companies to manufacturing firms to service businesses. Last month, I helped a California software company establish partnerships with universities in Chile and Colombia. Next week, I'm presenting at a conference in Chicago about sustainable development opportunities in Central America." That sounds like very specialized expertise. It is, but there's growing demand for it. American companies are realizing that successful international expansion requires more than just translating marketing materials. You need to understand how business relationships work in different cultures, what regulatory requirements look like, how to build trust with local partners. Sophia pulled out her tablet and showed Harold some slides from her recent presentations, charts showing trade growth between the United States and Mexico, case studies of successful international partnerships, maps illustrating emerging market opportunities. These numbers are impressive, Harold said, studying the trade statistics. I had no idea there was so much business activity between the U.S. and Mexico. Most people don't, but the economic integration between our countries is much deeper than most Americans realize. That's why cultural understanding is so important. We're not just neighbors, we're major trading partners. As I listened to these conversations, I realized that my family members weren't just impressive individually. Together, they represented a comprehensive picture of successful Mexican-American integration. Miguel's architecture work, Diego's medical practice, Sophia's business consulting, and Carlos's agricultural company collectively demonstrated expertise in design, healthcare, international commerce, and sustainable development. And all of this was happening in my front yard, documented by neighbors who were discovering that the quiet widow they'd barely noticed for 42 years was actually connected to a network of accomplished professionals spanning multiple industries and 2 countries. But the most interesting reaction came from Veronica Sterling, who had been conspicuously absent from the informal neighborhood gatherings where people were meeting my family members. I could see her watching from her front windows, clearly aware that something significant was happening, but apparently unsure how to insert herself into conversations that were occurring spontaneously rather than at organized events she could control.
That evening, Veronica finally made her move. She appeared at my front door around 6 o'clock, dressed in another expensive outfit, and carrying what appeared to be a bottle of wine. "Elena, I brought this for your family celebration," she announced, though Thanksgiving was still 2 days away. "I was hoping to meet the rest of your family members who arrived today." "How thoughtful, Veronica. Please come in." I led her to the living room where Sofia, Carlos, Miguel, and Diego were relaxing after dinner, sharing stories about their respective work and enjoying the kind of easy family conversation that comes from people who genuinely enjoy each other's company. "Everyone, I'd like you to meet my neighbor, Veronica Sterling. Veronica, this is my daughter Sofia and her husband Carlos, and you've already met my son-in-law Miguel and my son Diego." The introductions were polite and cordial, with my family members displaying the kind of gracious social skills that come from regular interaction with diverse groups of people. But I could see Veronica calculating, trying to assess how she could best position herself to benefit from these new connections. "Sophia, Elena mentioned that you work in international business consulting," Veronica said. "That must be fascinating. I have some experience in luxury property development, and I've been thinking about expanding into international markets." "What kinds of properties do you develop?" Sophia asked politely. "High-end residential and resort properties. I'm particularly interested in opportunities in Mexico, given the growing market for luxury vacation properties." Carlos and Sophia exchanged a quick glance, so brief that Veronica missed it, but I caught it immediately. They were both thinking the same thing. Here was another American who assumed that opportunities in Mexico were simply there for the taking by anyone with enough capital and ambition. "The Mexican luxury property market is quite sophisticated," Sophia said diplomatically. "Success typically requires extensive local partnerships and deep understanding of regional regulations and cultural preferences." "Exactly. That's why I think there could be wonderful opportunities for collaboration between American developers and Mexican professionals," Veronica said eagerly. "In fact, I was just discussing with Elena some ideas for a resort development project that might interest Miguel's architectural firm." Miguel looked surprised. "A resort development project? Elena didn't mention it?"
I think her property would be perfect for a boutique luxury resort. The location, the mature landscaping, the upscale neighborhood, it has everything needed for a high-end retreat experience. Miguel glanced at me, then back at Veronica. You want to develop a resort on my mother-in-law's property? I want to help Elena maximize the potential of her assets while creating a beautiful project that would showcase your architectural expertise to American clients. That's an interesting idea, Miguel said carefully. I have all the preliminary research ready, market analysis, financial projections, comparable properties. I think you'd be impressed with the potential returns. Diego leaned forward slightly. Veronica, may I ask what your background is in resort development? I've been involved in several luxury property projects over the years. Most recently, I consulted on the renovation of a boutique hotel in Napa Valley that's been very successful. Consulting on a hotel renovation is quite different from developing a resort from scratch, Carlos observed mildly. Of course, but the principles are similar. You identify an underutilized property with good bones. You create a business plan that maximizes revenue potential, and you find the right partners to execute the vision. Sophia nodded politely. And you see Elena's home as an underutilized property? I see it as a tremendous opportunity. Elena is maintaining almost 2 acres of prime real estate as a single-family residence. With the right development approach, the same property could generate substantial income while providing Elena with beautiful living accommodations and financial security. I see, Sophia said. And you think this would interest Miguel's firm? Absolutely. Miguel, your expertise in luxury resort architecture, combined with my knowledge of American luxury markets, could create something really special. Miguel was quiet for a moment, then smiled diplomatically. Veronica, I appreciate your confidence in my work, but I should probably clarify something about the scale of projects my firm typically handles. Of course, I'd love to learn more about your portfolio. Miguel pulled out his phone and began showing Veronica images of his recent projects. The $400 million resort complex in Costa Rica that included 3 hotels, 2 golf courses, and a private marina. The $250 million sustainable resort in the Riviera Maya that featured architecture integrated into protected jungle habitat. And the $500 million resort city in Cabo that was designed as a self-contained luxury destination. With each image, I watched Veronica's expression change as she began to understand the actual scale of Miguel's professional work. These are quite large projects, she said finally. My firm specializes in destination resort developments. We typically work with projects that include multiple hotels, recreational facilities, and commercial developments. Our smallest recent project was a $150 million resort expansion in Puerto Vallarta. I see, Veronica said quietly.
But I appreciate your interest in potential collaboration, Miguel added kindly. Perhaps we could discuss smaller-scale projects that might be more appropriate for your development experience. After Veronica left, much more quietly than she'd arrived, my family sat in my living room processing what had just happened. Mama, Sophia said finally, that woman wanted Miguel to design a resort on your property, and she had no idea that Miguel's firm does projects that cost more than the entire assessed value of this neighborhood? That appears to be the case. And she thought she could just insert herself into our family's business activities as if she was doing us a favor? She seems to have convinced herself that her expertise in American luxury markets would be valuable to us. Diego shook his head. The level of cultural ignorance is remarkable. She's been living across the street from you for 2 years and never bothered to learn anything about your background. But now she thinks she can become our business partner? What's most interesting, Carlos added, is that she still doesn't understand what happened. She thinks this conversation went badly because we weren't interested in her specific proposal, not because her entire approach was inappropriate. Miguel nodded thoughtfully. She reminds me of American developers I've met who assume that Mexican business relationships work the same way as American networking. They think success is just a matter of having the right contacts and making the right pitch. The sad part, Sophia said, is that if she'd approached this differently, if she'd simply acknowledged her previous behavior and tried to build a genuine relationship, we might have been happy to share information about business opportunities or cultural connections. Instead, Diego concluded, she's trying to monetize a relationship she spent 2 years trying to destroy. Well, I said, tomorrow brings the rest of the family, plus the diplomatic representatives. I suspect Veronica's education is just beginning. Mama, Carmen said, grinning, by the time this week is over, that woman is going to understand exactly what she's been dealing with. That, I replied, is precisely the point. Thanksgiving morning dawned crisp and clear, with the kind of perfect November weather that makes California the envy of the rest of the country. I woke at my usual 5:30 a.m., but instead of my customary quiet coffee and solitude, I was greeted by the wonderful sounds of a house full of family. Children's voices drifting from upstairs bedrooms, the aroma of Mexican coffee brewing in the kitchen, and the soft murmur of adult conversation from the living room where the early risers had already gathered. By 7 a.m., my house was bustling with the kind of organized chaos that only comes from large families preparing for major celebrations. Carmen and her daughter Isabella were in the kitchen working on the tres leches cake that had won prizes in San Miguel de Allende. Diego and Maria were preparing their famous mole poblano using the 6th-generation family recipe. Sofia was coordinating with Carlos to set up a tasting station for his company's organic products, while their teenage son, Miguel Jr., helped his grandfather, Miguel Sr., arrange the professional photography equipment they'd brought to document the celebration. But the most significant addition to our preparations was Consular Cultural Attaché Dr. Patricia Ramirez-Chen, who had arrived the evening before with a small team from the Mexican consulate in Los Angeles. Dr. Ramirez-Chen was an elegant woman in her 40s who held a PhD in International Cultural Studies and had spent her career documenting successful Mexican-American family integration stories for educational and diplomatic purposes. Mrs. Rodriguez-Martinez, Dr. Ramirez-Chen said as she reviewed the day's schedule over breakfast, I want you to know how honored we are to include your family in this cultural exchange documentation. Your family represents exactly the kind of multi-generational success story that both governments want to highlight in their cultural cooperation initiatives. We're delighted to participate, Dr. Ramirez-Chen. My family has always been proud of our heritage and our contributions to both countries. The preliminary research my team conducted on your family's achievements has been remarkable. Your children's success in Mexico, combined with your own 40-year career in American education and your husband's contributions to infrastructure development, represents a beautiful example of how cultural integration enhances both communities. Dr. Ramirez-Chen's team included a professional filmmaker, a cultural historian, and a photographer who would be documenting every aspect of our celebration for inclusion in educational materials used by both the Mexican Ministry of Tourism and the U.S. State Department's cultural exchange programs. At 9 a.m., Harold Peterson arrived with 3 other HOA board members carrying a formal proclamation declaring November 28th International Cultural Appreciation Day in Meadowbrook Estates. Harold looked genuinely moved as he read the proclamation aloud to my assembled family and the diplomatic representatives. Whereas Elena Rodriguez-Martinez has been a valued member of the Meadowbrook Estates community for 42 years, contributing to our neighborhood's character through her dedication to education, community service, and cultural enrichment, and whereas her family represents the finest example of successful international cultural integration while maintaining strong family traditions, the Meadowbrook Estates Homeowners Association hereby declares this day to be one of celebration and learning about the rich contributions of Mexican-American families to our community. The assembled family applauded politely, and Dr. Ramirez-Chen accepted the proclamation on behalf of the Mexican consulate, expressing appreciation for the community's forward-thinking approach to cultural celebration and international cooperation. But what made this moment particularly satisfying was seeing Veronica Sterling watching from her front window across the street. She'd clearly observed the arrival of the official vehicles with diplomatic plates, the professional filming equipment being unloaded, and the formal ceremony taking place in my front yard. I could only imagine what she was thinking as she watched the neighborhood she thought she controlled celebrating the family she'd spent 2 years trying to drive away. By 10 a.m., the cultural documentation was in full swing. Dr. Ramirez-Chen's filmmaker was capturing everything from Carmen teaching her daughters traditional cooking techniques to Diego explaining to his sons how their grandfather Miguel had helped build the infrastructure that made modern Meadowbrook Estates possible. The photographer was documenting the integration of Mexican and American traditions in our celebration. Traditional mole served alongside American turkey, children switching effortlessly between English and Spanish, professional accomplishments spanning 2 countries and multiple industries. Miguel Sr. gave an impromptu interview about sustainable architecture principles he'd learned from his late father-in-law, explaining how traditional Mexican building techniques had influenced his award-winning resort designs that were now being studied by environmental architects worldwide. Several neighbors with backgrounds in construction and engineering were fascinated by his descriptions of how traditional Mexican building methods could be adapted for modern American residential construction. Diego had attracted a group of parents interested in his community health work, particularly his strategies for addressing childhood obesity and social isolation through community design changes. He was explaining how his clinic's research on family health outcomes had influenced his recommendations for American suburban community planning. Carlos had set up his organic product tasting station, where neighbors were sampling coffee and chocolate while learning about sustainable agriculture practices that supported both environmental protection and fair wages for farming families. 3 neighbors asked for information about purchasing his products directly, and Mrs. Johnson inquired about visiting his company's farms during her planned vacation to Mexico.
Sophia was in her element, facilitating conversations between neighbors with international business interests and family members with relevant expertise. She'd somehow managed to connect Mr. Patterson's son, who worked for a California technology company, with Miguel Jr., who was studying international business and doing summer internships with Sophia's consulting firm, creating a networking opportunity that could benefit both young men's careers. But the most remarkable transformation was in how my neighbors were interacting with me. People who had barely acknowledged my existence for years were approaching me with genuine warmth and curiosity, asking about my family's achievements, my own career and education, and my experiences maintaining connections across 2 countries. "Elena, I had no idea you'd had such an interesting life," said Mrs. Patterson. 40 years teaching bilingual education, traveling regularly to Mexico, raising children who became so successful. Why didn't you ever tell us about all this?" "You never asked, Grace," I replied gently. "I've been here the whole time." "But we should have asked. I feel terrible that we've been neighbors for so long and I knew so little about your family and background." This sentiment was echoed throughout the afternoon as neighbors realized that their assumptions about the quiet widow next door had prevented them from discovering an extraordinary story of family success and cultural integration that had been happening right under their noses for decades. At 3 p.m., the moment I'd been anticipating finally arrived.
Veronica Sterling appeared at my backyard gate, dressed in an outfit that was clearly intended to convey both sophistication and humility. She'd obviously spent considerable time preparing for this encounter, but I could see uncertainty in her expression as she surveyed the scene. Official diplomatic representatives filming her neighbors, professional equipment documenting conversations, and a celebration that was clearly far more significant than she'd anticipated.
Elena, I hope it's all right that I came by. I didn't want to intrude, but this looks like such a wonderful celebration. Of course, Veronica, you're always welcome. I introduced Veronica to Dr. Ramirez-Chen, explaining that she was my neighbor from across the street. Dr. Ramirez-Chen greeted her with diplomatic courtesy, though I noticed her making subtle notes about the interaction for her cultural documentation. Mrs. Sterling, it's a pleasure to meet you. Elena's neighbors have been so welcoming to our cultural exchange documentation. Are you familiar with Elena's family's background? I'm learning about it carefully. Elena's family is quite accomplished. Indeed they are. Elena represents exactly the kind of family success story that our cultural exchange programs aim to highlight. Multiple generations of achievement, strong cultural identity maintenance, and significant contributions to both Mexican and American communities. I watched Veronica process this information, realizing that the woman she'd spent 2 years dismissing as a pathetic old woman with no family was being celebrated by official diplomatic representatives as an example of successful international family achievement. Mrs. Sterling, Dr. Ramirez-Chen continued, we're documenting how communities respond to cultural diversity and family success stories. As Elena's immediate neighbor, your perspective on living next to such an accomplished international family would be very valuable for our educational materials. Veronica glanced at me, clearly recognizing that she was being offered an opportunity to go on official record about her relationship with our family. I could see her calculating, trying to figure out how to respond in a way that would position her favorably while avoiding any reference to her previous behavior. Elena's family is remarkable. I've been so impressed by their professional achievements and their commitment to cultural traditions. Living next to Elena has been educational. In what way? Dr. Ramirez-Chen asked, clearly interested in this perspective. Well, I think many Americans don't fully understand the depth of Mexican-American family connections and achievements. Elena's family has shown me that cultural integration can create opportunities that benefit both countries. It was a carefully crafted response that avoided any acknowledgement of Veronica's previous assumptions or behavior, while positioning her as someone who had gained cultural understanding through proximity to our family. That's a wonderful perspective, Mrs. Sterling. Would you be willing to share those thoughts on camera for our educational materials? I could see Veronica weighing the opportunity to be featured in official diplomatic documentation against the risk of more detailed questions about her specific interactions with our family. I'd be honored, she said finally. The filmed interview took place in my front yard, with Veronica positioned so that both my house and hers were visible in the background. Dr. Ramirez-Chen's questions were professional and diplomatic, focusing on community integration and cultural appreciation rather than personal relationship details. Mrs. Sterling, as Elena's neighbor, what would you say to other American communities about the value of embracing Mexican-American families?
I would say that families like Elena's represent the best of cultural integration, Veronica replied smoothly. They maintain their heritage and traditions while also contributing significantly to American communities. Elena's 40-year career in education, her family's professional achievements, their business connections between our countries, these are exactly the kinds of contributions that make our communities stronger. Have you learned anything specific from your proximity to Elena's family? I've learned that assumptions based on superficial observations can prevent us from recognizing extraordinary people in stories. Elena appeared to be a quiet retiree, but in reality, she's the matriarch of an international family with achievements spanning architecture, medicine, business, and education. It's a reminder that we should always approach our neighbors with curiosity and respect, rather than assumptions. It was a masterful performance, transforming 2 years of harassment and prejudice into a story about cultural learning and community appreciation. But what made it particularly remarkable was that Veronica seemed to believe her own revisionist narrative, convincing herself that she'd always been supportive and curious rather than cruel and dismissive. After the interview, Veronica lingered at the celebration, attempting to insert herself into conversations with family members and diplomatic representatives. I watched her networking with the same aggressive efficiency she'd always brought to social situations, trying to build connections that could benefit her professionally or socially. But something had fundamentally changed in the dynamic. My family members were polite but distant, treating her with the kind of diplomatic courtesy you extend to someone whose motives you don't trust. The neighbors who had previously been impressed by Veronica's wealth and assertiveness were now more interested in learning from my family's genuine achievements than in catering to her social ambitions. Most tellingly, the other neighbors were beginning to remember and share their own experiences with Veronica's behavior toward me over the past 2 years. Mrs. Patterson mentioned to Dr. Ramirez-Chen that she'd always been uncomfortable with how dismissive some people were toward Elena, and Mr. Johnson made a comment about neighbors who made assumptions about people based on superficial observations. Dr. Ramirez-Chen, with her trained eye for cultural dynamics, was clearly picking up on these undercurrents and making notes for her documentation of community responses to cultural diversity. As the afternoon progressed, I found myself in conversation with Dr. Ramirez-Chen about the broader implications of our family story. Mrs. Rodriguez-Martinez, what strikes me most about your family's experience is how invisible your achievements were to your immediate community until they were formally recognized and documented. Have you reflected on why that might be? I think people see what they expect to see, Dr. Ramirez-Chen. My neighbors expected to see a retired teacher living quietly, so that's all they noticed. They didn't ask about my family, my travels, or my background because they'd already decided there was nothing interesting to discover. And yet, when your family's achievements were revealed, the community response has been overwhelmingly positive and engaged. Yes, but the achievements were always there. The only thing that changed was the context in which they were presented. When my son-in-law arrived with professional camera equipment, suddenly people were interested in learning about his work. When official diplomatic representatives began documenting our family, suddenly everyone wanted to participate in our celebration. So you think the community was capable of appreciating your family's contributions all along? I think most people are capable of appreciation when they're given permission to be curious. But curiosity requires recognizing that there might be something worth discovering, and that recognition often depends on external validation rather than genuine interest in individuals. Dr. Ramirez-Chen nodded thoughtfully. That's a profound observation that will be very valuable for our educational materials about community integration and cultural appreciation. As evening approached and the celebration began winding down, I found myself reflecting on how completely the dynamics in Meadowbrook Estates had transformed over the course of a single day. This morning, I'd been the quiet widow who lived alone and minded her own business. Tonight, I was the matriarch of an internationally successful family whose achievements were being documented for educational purposes by official diplomatic representatives. But more importantly, my neighbors had discovered that their assumptions about people can blind them to extraordinary stories happening right in front of them. They'd learned that cultural integration creates strength rather than division, and that families like mine represent resources for community enrichment rather than threats to property values. As for Veronica Sterling, she'd managed to avoid direct accountability for her previous behavior while positioning herself as someone who had always appreciated our family's contributions.
But she'd also learned that success based on intimidation and assumptions is fragile, while success based on genuine achievement and cultural integration is enduring.
The last guests left around 8 p.m., with neighbors expressing genuine appreciation for being included in our celebration and requesting invitations to future family gatherings. Dr. Ramirez-Chen and her team departed with hours of footage and dozens of photographs that would become part of official cultural exchange materials shared between the United States and Mexico. As my family gathered in the living room to debrief the day's events, Carmen raised the question we'd all been thinking about. Mama, what happens now? You've achieved everything you wanted, the community knows who we are, the neighbor who harassed you has been publicly educated about her assumptions, and you've been officially recognized for representing successful cultural integration. What happens now, mija, is that I continue living exactly as I choose, but with the satisfaction of knowing that my neighbors finally understand what they've been living next to for 42 years. And Veronica? Asked Diego. Veronica will continue being exactly who she's always been, but now she knows that cruelty toward people she doesn't understand can have consequences she doesn't anticipate. Do you think she's actually learned anything, or is she just adapting her approach to new information about our family's status? Asked Sophia. I think Veronica has learned that assumptions are dangerous, even if she hasn't learned to take responsibility for the harm her assumptions caused. But that's between her and her conscience. My responsibility was to show her that she was wrong about who she was dealing with, and that's been accomplished. Miguel Sr. smiled. Abuela Elena, I have to say, this was the most diplomatically elegant response to harassment I've ever witnessed. You turned a personal conflict into an educational opportunity that benefited the entire community. That's because the best revenge against prejudice is success, Miguel. And the best response to cruelty is to demonstrate the dignity and strength that cruelty can never diminish. Carlos raised his coffee cup in a toast. To Abuela Elena, who taught an entire neighborhood that you should never underestimate someone based on appearances, and who showed us all how grace under pressure creates better outcomes than anger or revenge. As my family toasted and laughed together in the living room of the house where I'd raised their parents, I felt a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with victory over Veronica Sterling and everything to do with the joy of being surrounded by people who truly understood and appreciated the life I'd built. Across the street, I could see lights on in Veronica's house, and I imagined her processing the day's events, trying to reconcile the image of the pathetic old woman she'd tormented with the reality of the internationally successful family matriarch who had just been celebrated by diplomatic representatives and embraced by the community she'd tried to turn against me. The next morning, I woke at my usual 5:30 a.m. to find Meadowbrook Estates restored to its customary quiet. My family was still sleeping, recovering from the excitement and rich food of the previous day. I made my coffee and settled onto my front porch to watch the sunrise, just as I had every morning for 42 years. But something fundamentally had changed. This morning, instead of being invisible to my neighbors, I was Elena Rodriguez-Martinez, the woman whose family had been featured in official diplomatic documentation, whose Thanksgiving celebration had become a community-wide cultural exchange event, and whose story of successful integration was now part of educational materials that would be shared internationally. At 7 a.m., my phone rang. It was my brother Francisco calling from Mexico City. Elena, I just received a call from the consulate in Los Angeles. Dr. Ramirez-Chen's preliminary report about yesterday's cultural exchange event has been forwarded to both the Mexican Ministry of Tourism and the U.S. State Department. They want to feature your family story in the next round of official cultural cooperation materials. That's wonderful, Francisco. But that's not why I'm calling, Elena. Dr. Ramirez-Chen mentioned in her report that your community's response to cultural diversity had been complicated. She noted that while most neighbors embraced the cultural exchange enthusiastically, there had been previous incidents of cultural insensitivity that made yesterday's celebration particularly meaningful.
Dr. Ramirez-Chen is very perceptive. Elena, did someone in your neighborhood discriminate against you because of your heritage? I thought carefully about how to answer. Francisco, someone in my neighborhood made assumptions about me based on limited observation and cultural prejudice, but yesterday's celebration provided all the education and accountability that was necessary. I see. Elena, you know that both governments take cultural discrimination very seriously, especially when it involves elderly citizens who represent successful integration stories. I appreciate that, Francisco, but sometimes the most powerful response to prejudice is simply demonstrating the dignity and strength that prejudice can never diminish. You're remarkable, Hermana. Most people would want formal complaints filed and official consequences. Most people didn't have the opportunity to turn their harassment into international recognition for their family's achievements. Francisco laughed. Elena, you've always been the most strategically brilliant person I know. You turned a neighborhood conflict into a diplomatic cultural exchange event. I turned cruelty into education, which benefits everyone more than punishment would.
After hanging up with Francisco, I sat on my porch thinking about the extraordinary transformation that had occurred in my life over the past month. 4 weeks ago, I'd been a dismissed and harassed elderly widow whose neighbors wished she would disappear. Today, I was an internationally recognized example of successful cultural integration whose family's achievements were being documented for educational purposes by 2 governments. The lesson wasn't just for Veronica Sterling, though she'd certainly received an education in the dangers of judging people by appearances. The lesson was for an entire community about the stories and resources that exist all around us when we approach our neighbors with curiosity rather than assumptions. As I finished my coffee and prepared to start another day in Meadowbrook Estates, I reflected on how satisfying it is when kindness ultimately triumphs over cruelty, when dignity proves stronger than harassment, and when the truth about people's lives turns out to be far more interesting than the assumptions others make about them. Veronica Sterling had told me to just die already because she thought I was a pathetic old woman with no family and no value to the community. Instead, I'd shown her, and everyone else, that I was the beloved matriarch of an internationally successful family whose story was now part of official cultural exchange materials shared between 2 countries. Sometimes the best response to cruelty is simply letting the truth speak for itself. And sometimes when you're patient enough and strategic enough, the truth turns out to be more powerful than anyone imagined.